I'd like to call our committee hearing back in session, and thank you all for your patience, and sorry that we had to break away, but we live our life through a bell, and they didn't like living it through bells, so we changed it to buzzards. Now we live our life by the sound of a buzzard, and we had to run out and vote. But I thank you all for being here, and I thank the panel. First, James August was previously Director of Occupational Health and Safety Program for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME. He is a Senior Policy Advisor to the Lippy Group, an occupational safety and health consulting firm. Daniel O. Chute is President of Atrium Environmental Health and Safety Services, which provides technical direction, project support, field investigations, and subject matter expertise on environmental health and safety matters for industrial and commercial clients. Gary Urban is a Certified Hazardous Materials Manager and Vice President Consulting Services of Aerosol Monitoring and Analysis, Inc. He is currently under contract with the Smithsonian and is in the process of conducting environmental assessments in 17 of the Smithsonian Museum buildings. William M. Brennan is Executive Vice President of Turner Construction Company that has worked on construction projects at the Smithsonian, including remodeling and asbestos abatement at the National Museum of American History Star Spangled Banner exhibit, which opened this fall. We thank you for your participation, and we would ask you to just push your mics closer, push your button, and Mr. August, we will start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
I will attempt to answer this committee's question, or at least draw reasonable conclusions that can be substantiated on the available information. I did not speak to any of the individuals involved as to whether the Smithsonian's treatment of asbestos and other hazardous materials at the National Air and Space Museum put employees and visitors in an unsafe environment. Before I go into my conclusions, I want to state briefly a few things about asbestos to put this discussion into context. First of all forms of asbestos, including chrysotile, which is the form that was found in the drywall compound throughout the Smithsonian, is a serious hazard. All forms of asbestos cause cancer and other serious diseases. Secondly, there is safe. Legal does not mean safe. There is no established safe threshold of exposure to asbestos. OSHA stated as much when it issued its proposed rule in 1990, and it said that even at continued exposure to asbestos at the permitted level and action level presents residual risks to employees which are still significant. Third, the key to protecting building service workers, and by extension everybody else in the building, staff and visitors, is to have a program that starts with inspection, communication of hazards, and procedures in place that prevent the uncontrolled disturbance of asbestos. And lastly, there is a very, very detailed legal framework established by OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as guidance that goes back to the 80s, and I'm a dinosaur that was involved in most of the development of that, so I have firsthand experience of how it came to be and all the lessons, hard lessons that were learned to come to the time when we finally realized how this hazardous material needed to be handled to prevent unnecessary exposure. I have 5 opinions to offer about the asbestos situation at the Air and Space Museum. First, it certainly appears that there have been serious deficiencies in the implementation of the Smithsonian's policies for addressing the presence of ACM over a prolonged period of time. Based on the asbestos survey performed by Versar, the Smithsonian knew in 1992 at the very latest that the Air and Space Museum was constructed with ACM. They identified several types of building materials, including the drywall joint compounds, throughout the building, and they classified it as CODE, monitors to be monitored for change in their condition, and recommended, and this quote, maintenance and custodial personnel should be alerted to the presence of this material and instructed not to disturb it. Chapter 22 of the Smithsonian Institution's safety policy contains a very comprehensive program to protect everybody from asbestos. However, it appears that there has been a very, very serious disconnect between the stated policies and the actual practices at the NASM for a very long time. According to the March 15th, 2009 Washington Post article, Mr. Richard Pullman, a lighting specialist, had worked at the museum for 27 years, was informed by the museum safety coordinator during a briefing on asbestos awareness that there was asbestos in the museum walls. An effective, as you've asked in your questions, an effective asbestos operations and maintenance program begins with identification of the locations of asbestos and notification to the employees. My second conclusion is that the failure to notify building service workers of the locations of ACM, provide training and equipment, and the Smithsonian's policy, there have been violations of the policies and the laws. OSHA requires wet methods, local exhaust ventilation, mini exclosures, respirators, exposure monitoring, all intended to, quote, minimize the exposure to employees performing the asbestos work and bystander employees. They also require 16 hours of training for those involved in maintenance activities in order to do the work safely. In fact, OSHA cited the Smithsonian on July 8, 2008 for unsafe and unhealthful working conditions at the Air and Space Museum. They were cited for a failure to monitor workers' exposure, not notifying employees of the presence and location of ACM, and a lack of proper training. My third conclusion is that building service workers likely have been repeatedly exposed to significant asbestos exposure as a result of uncontrolled disturbances of ACM. The exposure of building service workers is episodic in nature. To determine that exposure, it is necessary to conduct personal air sampling while the maintenance activity is taking place. Personal air sampling involves the worker wearing a pump on his or her waist that draws air through a tube with the opening near the worker's breathing zone, the mouth and nose. Asbestos fibers that are in the air are collected in a cassette and then sent off to a laboratory for analysis. I have not seen any personal sampling data, if it exists, that was conducted during maintenance activities that disturb ACM at the Smithsonian. However, studies that I'm very, very familiar with show that maintenance work does disturb ACM and that in the absence of controls have shown significant exposure during such activities. The only sampling data I have seen are the measurements obtained by Aerosol Monitoring Analysis on December 9 and 11 of 2008. They performed a different kind of monitoring called ambient air monitoring, which means sampling of an area, and did so in 25 places at the museum. These data are irrelevant for making any determination of building service workers' exposure to asbestos and should not be used to reassure workers about the hazards that might be present. The 8-hour samples were collected between approximately 6 p.m. and 2 o'clock a.m. when the museum was closed. There is nothing in AMA's narrative that indicates that any maintenance work involving the disturbance of ACM was being conducted at the time the samples were collected, and since the museum was closed, potential air movement generated by a crowd of visitors was also probably diminished. OSHA requires clearance sampling after asbestos work is performed. This entails utilizing aggressive air sampling to create a worst-case scenario before the plastic containment area is disassembled. The air is stirred up with blowers to make asbestos fibers that may have settled become airborne. Only when asbestos levels are below established exposure limits while aggressive sampling is performed is an area considered clean and safe to be re-entered without utilizing protective measures. Taking passive ambient air samples in areas where there is settled dust and no work or other activities being performed that could disturb the dust therefore fails to yield useful determinations of worker or anybody else's exposure. Rather than drawing comfort from AMA's results, I find the situation quite disconcerting. Sampling was done in areas where there was an accumulation of settled dust, which raises disturbing questions such as, for how long and how often have employees and contractors conducted uncontrolled disturbances of ACM? How long has the asbestos-containing dust and debris been accumulating? Have ordinary vacuums and brooms been used to clean up dust and debris instead of HEPA vacuums and wet methods as prescribed by law? My fourth observation is that the diagnosis of asbestos of a long-term employee whose jobs involved the disturbance of drywall joint compound that contain asbestos should be regarded as a sentinel health event. And medical screening should be immediately conducted to identify the extent, if any, of asbestos-related signs, symptoms, or disease among other NASM employees and probably at other Smithsonian facilities. Mr. Pullman's claim for workers' compensation is under appeal, and I am not commenting on the validity of that claim. I am not familiar with Mr. Pullman's occupational or exposure history. However, the diagnosis of asbestosis in a 27-year employee whose duties involve the uncontrolled disturbance of ACM with saws and drills should be an impetus to determine if other employees are similarly effective. There are well-established protocols for conducting medical surveillance and to identify individuals with these signs of disease or impairment. The last issue concerns whether the treatment of asbestos has put any visitors at the Air and Space Museum in an unsafe environment. As I have just explained, it is my opinion that previous activities of building service workers and contractors that involve the uncontrolled disturbance of ACM would have released fibers into the surrounding environment. There is insufficient data to characterize the exposure to the workers, nor do I think there's any adequate data to make any definitive qualitative or quantitative estimates of any additional risk posed to visitors that resulted from the activities of building service workers and contractors. The AMA sampling data represent a snapshot of conditions they tested for on December 9th and 11th, and that is all they represent. For these reasons stated above, the AMA results do not provide a useful assessment of worker exposure during their normal activities. As for exposure to visitors, I don't see any other data to evaluate whether the sampling results were representative. Given the information I have reviewed concerning the handling of asbestos at the Air and Space Museum, I have questions and concerns about possible exposure situations to asbestos in other Smithsonian facilities. Many of the Smithsonian's buildings are much older than the Air and Space Museum and much more likely to have been constructed with a far greater quantity and variety of asbestos materials, for purposes of fireproofing, surfacing, thermal insulation, and other uses. And due to their age, and they might be in worse shape and more easily disturbed. I request that my entire statement be put into the record, and I would be happy to answer any questions that the committee members may have.
Thank you. Mr. Chute?
Okay, well, thank you. I've been invited to provide testimony to summarize my views and opinions on the management of asbestos-containing materials in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And my testimony will be based upon my education and experience gained in over 30 years of professional practice in the evaluation and control of asbestos in both public and commercial buildings, and my review of pertinent materials on the Smithsonian's practices and procedures, which have been provided to me by committee staff in advance of this hearing. I've organized my testimony to address general requirements and standard practices for asbestos management in public buildings, asbestos management practices and procedures as documented by the Smithsonian for their Air and Space Museum, and then a comparison of those to see how the Smithsonian's measure up to current practices. First, of course, asbestos is a common ingredient in many materials found in buildings constructed prior to 1980. That would include things such as floor tile, pipe insulation, wall materials, it's possible, roofing, and so forth. But in order to prevent illnesses which may be associated with asbestos exposure, the handling, removal, and disposal of asbestos has been subject to strict federal regulations implemented by both the EPA and OSHA since the early 1970s. Many states, localities, agencies, and private employers have enacted much stricter requirements for task-specific items which they may encounter. Also, it's important to note that the presence of asbestos in a building does not mean that the health of building occupants is endangered. As long as asbestos-containing materials remain in good condition and are not disturbed or damaged, exposure is unlikely. And in fact, the U.S. EPA generally recommends in-place management and maintenance to prevent exposure in areas where asbestos is discovered. Don't mess with it. Most facilities today follow a site-specific written asbestos management plan with assigned duties and responsibilities. The U.S. General Services Administration has cited the key elements of an asbestos management plan to include manage the asbestos in place as long as it is in good visual condition, abating or removing asbestos that is damaged or subject to disturbance, comply with applicable OSHA and EPA regulations and standards for the handling, transportation, disposal of the material, use products that do not contain asbestos for new construction and renovation or repair, require that trained and qualified persons do the work in your facilities, and then also promote openness and communication with your customers, regulatory agencies, the public, and other interested parties during renovation, repair, or other activities which may encounter asbestos. Now, in a review of the Smithsonian's policies, they have as their director cited in his earlier testimony, they have a comprehensive safety manual, which includes Chapter 22 for asbestos. The asbestos control procedure in the Smithsonian Safety Manual appears to be very detailed and comprehensive and has defined roles and responsibilities for building managers, for safety coordinators, supervisors, their employees, facilities management, design and construction offices, the real estate division, and the health, safety, and environmental management group. In addition, they have a series of attachments to that which have site or task-specific procedures outlined, defining training requirements and checklists for the safe work practices on regular routine operations which they may encounter. It's also important to note that all levels of training require an annual update and review within their policy. In summary, this evaluation has compared Smithsonian policy for asbestos management and control to the regulations and practices in place for similar facilities in a workplace or construction setting. Based upon a review of the written Smithsonian policies, reports, and materials provided by committee staff, a comparative analysis of applicable regulations and standards, and my 30 years of professional experience in this area of technical specialization, I found the Smithsonian Institution asbestos control policy as written to be quite complete and comprehensive. Please be aware that this evaluation has not concluded an on-site evaluation in their facilities or audits to determine how effectively these policies have been implemented in daily practice. But by fully implementing an asbestos control procedure as written in their safety manual, the Smithsonian should be able to maintain a safe and healthy work environment for its employees and the general public that is consistent with the current standards and practices in the field.
Thank you. Mr. Urban?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Gary Urban. I'm a Vice President for Aerosol Monitoring and Analysis, which is located here in Hanover, Maryland. Aerosol Monitoring and Analysis has been in business for 27 years, providing environmental, industrial hygiene, and health and safety consulting and training services. We are a full-service company whose capabilities include consulting, laboratory, and training services, including but not limited to asbestos. Our staff includes certified industrial hygienist, a certified safety professional, certified hazardous materials manager, as well as EPA-accredited asbestos inspectors, management planners, and project designers who provide multifunctional environmental consulting services, design support, and hazardous materials management to our clients. Our firm provides services to government, industry, building owners and managers, architects, engineers, and contractors. I have been employed by the firm for the past 17 years, during which time I've provided consulting services to such government agencies as the General Services Administration, Architect of the Capitol, Smithsonian, and DoD. Professionally, I'm a certified hazardous materials manager with 21 years of experience in hazardous materials management, primarily involving asbestos surveys, asbestos abatement design, asbestos abatement remediation oversight, and asbestos management and asbestos operations and maintenance programs. I am trained and licensed as an EPA asbestos inspector, management planner, supervisor competent person, and project designer. During the past several years, our firm has provided a variety of consulting and laboratory and training services to the Smithsonian Institution at several facilities. Past projects have included work at the Castle Building, the Arts and Industries Building, the Garber facility, as well as the Museum Support Center, to name a few. These projects involved inspection, testing, design for abatement, hazard assessments, including but not limited to asbestos. Recently, our firm was awarded a contract in August of 2008 to reassess Smithsonian facilities to provide an update to existing asbestos information survey reports in the majority of the Smithsonian buildings, facilities, and museums. The work involves a review of the available asbestos documentation for each specific site, field inspections to verify site conditions pertaining to the presence, quantity, and location and condition of the previously identified asbestos materials. The work also includes assessing, documenting, and in some cases testing additional suspect materials not previously identified, so as to provide a more complete picture of the asbestos situation within a given facility. At the completion of the inspection, we provide a summary report of findings, results of any testing conducted, an electronic copy of the available documentation, and input the field inspection data into an SI-generated geospatial database that interfaces with the SI Facility Center version 8i. This database will enable SI to better manage the presence, quantity, and location of asbestos within a given facility. I am the project manager for this contract and serve as the single point of contact for the Smithsonian Institution. This assignment has provided me with a unique and extensive knowledge of the challenges posed by the Smithsonian the types and locations and extent of asbestos materials in the institution, as well as insights on how these materials can best be managed to ensure safety to staff, contractors, and visitors. In most recent past, our firm provided asbestos general area air monitoring for SI at the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall, in response to a claim that the air was unsafe as asbestos was identified in bulk and settled dust samples collected by others. At the time of our testing, we provided evidence that the airborne fiber concentration observed throughout the museum in both public and non-public spaces identified fiber concentrations of less than or equal to 0.005 fibers per cc of air by phase contrast microscopy. For comparison purposes, the OSHA has established a permissible exposure limit of 0.1 fibers per cc over an 8-hour time-weighted average. Furthermore, the reoccupancy level for an asbestos removal project where PCM is utilized is less than 0.01 fibers per cc. Thank you for inviting me here today. I will be pleased to address any questions that you have on what I've stated here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brennan?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Lundgren and Harper and attendees. Turner was engaged in 2006 to undertake the renovation of the Star Spangled Banner exhibit, which, as Mr. Clough described earlier, was coincident with their starting to establish.
I'm sorry, could you push your mic
I believe it's green.
a little further to you, maybe?
Coincident with
better.
their beginning to upgrade and expand on their OSHA safety procedures and manual. And we were glad to participate, along with a number of other contractors, to bring to them our experience of 105 years in the business from the construction point of view as it relates to operating in an existing facility such as the Smithsonian. So we work closely with the Smithsonian staff, our own professional designers and architects, and specialty subcontractors to participate in writing an overall program, as well as doing an investigation of the space that we were going to conduct the renovation work in. We did not investigate outside of our defined construction area, but we did go in and investigate the areas that we were going to be contacting to determine the types of the materials that we would encounter. Throughout the complete development of that plan, I never, ever felt we did not have the complete highest level of support from the institution towards safety of our staff, our employees, the tradesmen, the employees of the Smithsonian, and the eventual visitors to the facility. Safety was always the paramount driver to the protocols and procedures that we developed. I'd like to just give you a quick overview of the methodology that we used in arriving at the procedures manuals and policies that we employed throughout the construction period. So we worked closely with Smithsonian. We employed an accredited, licensed professional consulting firm named Maytech to come in and help investigate and identify all the materials throughout the facility. Part of our procedures were to also identify subcontractors that would actually do the abatement. All of those firms had to be OSHA certified, EPA accredited, licensed to do business in the District of Columbia, and all the credentials had to be at the highest level of standards. We then went on to set up a policy for selecting subcontractors that were knowledgeable about working in a facility such as this. It's an occupied facility, it's a renovation. We wanted contractors who had the experience and expertise having done similar complex renovation work such as this in a building that we knew was going to have hazardous materials of a variety of types. In the survey, which took about 2 months in 2006, we thought we might encounter asbestos, we thought we might encounter lead, we thought we might encounter PCBs, and we encountered 2 of the 3. We did not find any PCBs, but we did find a variety of lead-containing and asbestos-containing materials. So that was the substances around which we wrote the protocols and procedures that we would use throughout the construction period when and if these substances were encountered. We estimated that we might encounter 40 to 50 episodes of containment materials, and the protocol in construction is, as the gentleman has stated, if you're not going to disrupt it, leave it alone. But if you're going to disrupt it, then there's a protocol for what the methodology is, the type of bagging, the type of masking, the type of safing off, the type of shutting down air system procedures and protocols that have to be employed. The professional testing firm then comes in and certifies that the area is clean after the abatement is done, and at that point, and only that point, are people engaged to go back into the area and do traditional construction work. Around that time frame is a variety of safing off and restrictions and hanging of polyethylene and putting various types of fans and filters in place to positive or negative pressurize the areas that are being worked in so as to prevent the material from getting outside the containment abatement area. All of that was written up. We pre-selected subcontractors who had experience exercising protocols such as this. We wrote into their subcontract a very rigorous procedure should they encounter any materials such as tile or mastic, what they were to do, and I'll walk through that in a second. But every award of a subcontract, we sat down with their senior management and made sure that they understood the procedures, that properly priced them and could carry them out effectively. We made sure that they would have an OSHA 30-hour certified professional on site at any time when their staff was working. We set up training programs for each individual employee who was going to come on the job to make sure each employee understood the requirements and the protocols. And to summarize it, basically every subcontractor had a policy in his contract which stated the following: if you should encounter any material which you believe could be either lead or asbestos or in any way a hazardous material, you're to immediately stop work, notify one of our supervisors or one of the owner's supervisors or the on-site asbestos containment professional. We then would go in, test it. If it was a hazardous material, we would set up the appropriate protocols to abate it, come back within a few days and verify that the containment had worked. There were no extraneous fibers left in the area, and then the professional would say the area is clear for you to go back in and work. And that was a part of every subcontract. Just to summarize, as I said, throughout both the development of these procedures as well as the implementation, as I said, we thought we might encounter 30 or 40. We ended up encountering 250 situations that required abatement. And despite excessive additional costs on the institution's part, they never once backed off, holding us to the highest standards of safety, notification, abatement, adjust the schedule later on, but don't compromise any of the procedures at all as set up in the manual. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I'd like to just a few questions. Mr. August, what kind of tests are the most reliable tests that, in your opinion, to find whether a building has asbestos or not in it?
Well, there's different tests for different situations.
One more thing. Is there that's okay, I'm sorry. Is there a way of doing that without exposing it? Is there a way of doing it without bothering it? Because when asbestos is concealed, you can probably stay that way as long as it's not interrupted or bothered or hit or broken into.
Right. There's different tests for different situations. If you want to find out, for example, in this room, if any of these walls, the ceiling, the floor tiles, or whatever have asbestos, you can, number one, check to see the records. Maybe that would tell you if those are available. Or if you have to actually sample, then what we do is called bulk sampling, which is in a controlled way, we take a core sample all the way through the material, and then that is sent to a laboratory where they will use, there's two types of, I don't want to get into the technicalities, there's two types of microscopes. There's phase contrast microscopy, which was referred to, and there's a much more sophisticated kind, which is transmission electron microscopy, and that is the more definitive test. But that will tell you whether or not there's asbestos present, and the legal definition is 0.1%. If that's present, then the material is considered asbestos containing. I mentioned another type of testing, though, which is if you want to find out what somebody is exposed to, then you have to find out what's in the air, and the personal sampling device is the most useful because that's taking air from right where somebody is breathing while something is happening. So that's going to give you the most accurate exposure monitoring.
Thank you. Mr. Chute, what, in your opinion, is the top priority that the Smithsonian should focus on to ensure the safety of its workers, the safety of its construction people, and the safety of its guests?
Well, I think by adhering to the written policies that are in place, they would be able to demonstrate that they are properly following, I guess, the goals and also the legal intent of those programs. That is, make sure they have proper documentation that people are trained, that they receive the right level of training, and also having good access to the monitoring data to show that they've done the correct type of testing to identify the location of asbestos and verify that air quality meets current standards.
Mr. Urban, you are looking at our Smithsonian buildings as we speak.
Yes, sir.
How many have you looked into?
Right now, we have gone through, I believe, 9. We're doing 17, maybe 8, but we're on the ground right now.
Any results you can share with us?
You know, I was, in the beginning, we had a 1992 report which we were going to go through, and quite frankly, I've been pleasantly surprised that a lot of the Versar reports are fairly complete. Now, we do find additional materials, and that is standard practice in a lot of the inspections that we conduct. A lot of the materials have been removed. And that's what we are doing. We are going to be able to provide Smithsonian, in my little speech there, I indicated the Geospatial Database, which basically will enable the Smithsonian to go room by room and identify the presence, quantity, and location of the materials that are in each one of those rooms. So that's a big deal right there, you know, to communicate that hazard to the employees and contractors alike.
Just to be fair, Mr. Brennan, what do you do when you encapsulate? I mean, I know what you do. When you encapsulate, it's your job to encapsulate it also, and you encapsulate it, you bag it. You take that to a special recycling area. And let me tell you why. I've been involved in construction myself, and I know that early on you encapsulate, you put it into a certain type of bag that's provided to you, and they take it to a certain disposal. I see the bags laying in the disposal, just laying there and getting broken up, get banged around by other people dumping other stuff on there. Is that the case? I mean, you know, I mean, I'm not saying you do that, but when it's left at some of these disposal plants, what are they supposed to do? Burn it? What happens with it?
Congressman, I'm not sure how they actually treat it at the plants. But, you know, our job is to make sure it gets to
there.
an EPA-certified disposal facility. And it's a challenging process. It's a difficult business to monitor, but our company, we go through bills of lading, signs off, verification. We have an online system where the actual receipt of the materials at the disposal, they have to log in and confirm the bill of lading, the proper tag numbers, so we can verify what left our site got there. We measure comparable weights of the vehicle and tonnage in the truck to make sure it wasn't half here, half there. It's something that you have to create a culture of continuous attention to detail and monitoring, and just entertain no transgressions, zero tolerance for any sort of transgressions of the rule. Once you have good policies set up, you have to enforce them rigorously.
Does anybody know what happens to them, how they dispose of them?
Well, the landfill, after an abatement is completed, they, you know, bag the waste and it's taken to a landfill, at which time the landfill covers up the material in specified cells.
Do they mix it with all the other landfills? Are they supposed to mix it with all the other landfills?
My understanding, and I probably shouldn't even speak on it because I'm not 100% sure, but, you know, they go in cells in designated areas of permitted landfills.
You're shaking your head.
I don't know the exact procedures, but there are registered places within landfills that are to receive the place. It isn't just goes out with the trash. So they're presumably it's being segregated and handled in a way that it really is buried.
Presumably.
Presumably.
So, but there are only certain landfills or certain disposal that are qualified to receive.
Yeah, there's another regulation, the NESHAPs, the air pollution standard. Anyway, they have, that regulation's been in place for a long time, and before any abatement takes place even, there has to be a notification to EPA of what's going to happen, how dust is going to be controlled, how much is going to be removed, what type of material, and then it's how it's going to be disposed of, and then you have to get a permit before you can even take it there. Am I correct from the people in the field? That you have NESHAPs regulations so that you have a way to track even before the work begins that in fact it's being disposed of according to regulations.
The trucking company has to be permitted and licensed, as does the landfill, designated landfill. It has to be permitted all the way along. The remover, the trucker, the disposal landfill all have special permits.
Is that the same for residential buildings?
Yes.
Thank you. Any questions from Mr. Lundgren?
I'll just ask a couple, and I hope folks down there didn't think by me closing my eyes or anything, I was not paying attention. For some reason, these lights are very irritating, and we're going to have to do something about the environment of the lights in here, because otherwise I'll be sitting up here with sunglasses, and that's not a California deal. It actually hurts my eyes. And we were told they couldn't do anything about it. So we'll find out how to do that. For all of you, based on your backgrounds in environmental health and safety in the workplace, I think you're all here when Secretary Clough testified. Is there anything that you would add to what he outlined in terms of what the Smithsonian is doing and he intends it to do? Mr. August?
Yeah, I was actually quite impressed with the seriousness with which he took the situation, and I agree with the other panelists that, in fact, on paper, there are very good procedures in place. And, in fact, if they had been followed, we wouldn't be having these hearings. But his problem is, as you mentioned, the cleaning up after the elephant. I don't know how many years this has been going on where the policy may not have been worth the paper it was written on. And I think
but based on what he said, in terms of what he outlined,
yeah,
you would believe that sounds responsible?
I would add this to what he's done.
Okay.
He mentioned something to the effect that employees could visit or should visit the Employee Health Center. I would go a step further, and I would look at records of current and even former employees at either in Space Museum as well as other Smithsonian facilities, and I would look at their job classifications and their years of service, and I would set up a screening program to find out, in fact, how many other Mr. Pullmans there are. I would fear that he is the tip of the iceberg, and that these people are going to fall through the cracks. They're going to go to their personal doctors. They're going to file their own insurance claims, or they're going to.
So you would recommend setting up some sort of formal
Absolutely.
screening process
Absolutely.
to see if there is anybody else out there.
Yeah, and that's because all the sampling that's being done is fine for prospectively, but we have no way retrospectively to go back and find out. All we have are, unfortunately, are signs of exposure, which is disease.
Yes. Anybody else have any recommendations beyond what Secretary Clough said?
The one comment I would add.
Go ahead.
The policy is great. Our business, just like his staff, you have constant turnover every year. You have people coming into the museum who are pedestrians. The enforcement aspect of it is really critical. You can train somebody one day, and the next day somebody else is in that position doing the same job. You have to train all over again. It's ongoing. It's a cultural thing that you have to create so that everybody is conscious of what needs to be done. That's really what supports a healthy policy.
Thank you. Mr. Chute?
Yes, well, again, it appears that the Secretary cannot speak back into the past for what might have happened in years past, but from listening to both Mr. Urban and Mr. Brennan, it appears that there has been a history of close attention to asbestos, at least during design, construction, and various phases of abatement. So possibly the Secretary would be able to retrieve some of the historical data that might be compartmentalized in the design and construction and the other divisions, which might be able to paint a more complete picture of how things really are. Because at this point, nobody can really tell you what the air fiber levels were one day 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But if you have a demonstrated history of monitoring at various phases of design and construction, which show you that these things have been well controlled, you may be in a better position to respond as an organization to say, we have monitored at various phases along the way, and this shows a history of effective control, and which might soothe some of the concerns about some of the employees if they are able to demonstrate that level of positive enforcement of the policies.
Mr. Brennan, I think I heard in your testimony you say something to the effect that you expected to maybe have 40 instances where you would run into asbestos, and you had multiples of that.
250.
To what do you attribute that difference in assessment versus what actually occurred, and were there some real surprises over and above the number?
There are two things that contributed to it. One, at the point in time that we did the above-the-ceiling investigation, we were still in the process of designing the actual work that we were going to install. So where the drawings may have said we were going to tie into a piece of ductwork here, when we actually got the design completed, maybe we were 10 feet away. And that 10 feet could have meant a difference between an incident and not an incident. The second was a major surprise, in that all the steel beams in the building were encased in concrete. And we looked up at that and saw no exposure whatsoever. And when we got in there and we started taking the concrete off to attach new steel, on the steel was lead-based paint underneath the concrete. So that alone was probably 60 or 70 of the incidents. And then the third one was a lead-based paint that we looked at. It was gold leaf, actually, and we thought it was what's called a peel and stick removal. Just put this paper over it, and the adhesive peels it off, and you take it and dispose of it. And it turned out that the paint had actually impregnated the underlying plaster. It's now a dust-laden material, so it became a complete drop to tarps, negative pressure, a much more complicated incident to deal with. So those are the three areas I'd say magnified it even beyond our expectations. A complex renovation like that, phase by phase, you can't go in all areas at the same time. We knew it would be tricky, but to more than double it caught us by surprise.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your testimony. Thank you for your interest, your insight, and your expertise. We do appreciate it. We do appreciate you being here today, so thank you. I'd like to now ask unanimous consent to place various materials in the record. Ask unanimous consent to place in the hearing record reports by Aerosol Monitoring and Analysis, Inc., and a document dated January 6, 2009, a report by Kinnock Environmental Management dated December 1st, 2008, and a report by Versard dated November 25th, 1992. And I ask unanimous consent to keep the record open to receive additional statements and material, to include answers to additional written questions members may wish to submit to the Smithsonian or to our witnesses present today. Thank you. Appreciate it. This hearing is now adjourned.